And the wrestlers would always talk about storytelling in the matches. And that intrigued me because I'm drawing superhero comics. So like, you're telling me I can tell a story in the fight scene.
You just heard from this week's guest. I'm Christian Gossett.
I'm Chris Simon.
And I'm David Hyde.
Welcome to the Superfan podcast, where the people who make the comics you love talk about the things they love that aren't comics. Thank you as ever to Low and the Shag for our theme song. This week's episode is brought to you by Fanbase Press and Superfan Promotions.
Jim Rugg is an Eisner and Ignatz Award-winning cartoonist, designer, zine maker, and illustrator. His books include Alien Disclosure, Who, What, When, Where, and Why Now, Conspiracy Comics, True Crime Comics, 1986 Zine, Hulk Grand Design, Street Angel, The Plain Janes, BW, Aphrodisiac, For Adults Only, Super Mag, Octobriana 1976, and Rambo 3.5.
He is the creator of YouTube's Cartoonist Kayfabe channel. His comics are part of the Smithsonian Permanent Collection, the National Archives, and the Heinz History Center. He taught visual storytelling at the School of Visual Arts and the Animation Workshop in Denmark. Jim loves comic books, zines, lettering, podcasts, running, pro wrestling, pizza, of course. I mean, who doesn't love pizza? We all love pizza. We can all agree on that. And cats. Another one that everybody can agree on is cats.
No, they can't.
No, you don't like cats? Not a cat person?
No, I am, but people don't agree on that.
Really? That's true. Disney hated cats. You know that?
Well, there's cat people and there's dog people.
Right. I love cats. I love cats and dogs, but that's me.
Yeah.
He lives and draws in Pittsburgh. Hi, Jim.
Hello.
So, wrestling. How old were you when you had that moment?
So I was younger as a wrestling fan than I was a comic book fan. And my mother discouraged me from watching wrestling, because it's obviously looks very violent and certainly didn't want me to do any of that to my sister. But it's television and I found it. Wrestling used to be like a Saturday morning, cartoons would sort of lead into wrestling, Sunday mornings, stuff like that. So it was a lot different whenever I was younger and started watching it. And I don't know exactly why it spoke to me. I was probably a little boy who loved to roughhouse, so wrestling was just the greatest, and these guys looked like superheroes. At the time, it would have been, the mid 80s, so they were very colorful. That's that early WWF era of like the Hulk Hogan and the Macho Man Randy Savage, and these characters that honestly looked like superheroes. They looked like characters out of a comic book. I hadn't discovered comic books yet, but I had the same reaction whenever I, did discover them. And with the wrestling, I was always drawing as a kid. I never stopped drawing. Everybody draws when they're 5. And then by 5th grade, I was the weirdo in the back of the class that was still drawing. I was actually drawing wrestlers, so when I discovered comic books, I was probably 10 or 11. The comic books looked like what I was drawing because I'm already drawing like these big muscular, people in costumes fighting each other. And it just, it was just dynamite. It was like a live action cartoon. I would go from watching Looney Tunes to watching Hulk Hogan, and it was like not that big of a divide between those two things.
Absolutely not. In the mid 80s, I feel like wrestling was just a part of culture at that point. I mean, I was never particularly interested in wrestling, but I knew everything about it. I mean, who didn't know like Roddy Piper and Hulk Hogan and all of them. I mean, it was just so much part of, like the 80s. I hate to say it, but it really was. So.
It's been a part of pop culture for forever. I was actually just listening to a podcast today, and they were talking about the first televised wrestling program, which goes back to like 1940. And, it wasn't widely disseminated then. I mean, people didn't even have televisions for the most part then. But by the 50s, it was on television because it was something that could be shot relatively inexpensively. And, you're trying to sell televisions, and believe it or not, like everybody liked wrestling from kids to like their grandmothers. And so it was very popular early programming, and it never really fell out of that. The television was always a major part of how wrestling promoters sold tickets. And so, once it started to kind of break into territories, then you would have local regional wrestling television, which varied a lot. Some people were very into the production end, and certainly it looked better than others. And by the time you get to the 80s, you have Vince McMahon doing the high-end production. You talk about it always being part of pop culture, part of your memory of pop culture. One of the early WWF events was on MTV. They bring in Cyndi Lauper. They bring in Mr. T. So even if you weren't a wrestling fan, you might have been exposed to it because of the pop culture that was very intentionally put on top of it in order to sell it to the widest audience possible. And it had network, at that point, it had national network exposure with things like Saturday Night's Main Event. So it's not an accident that it was pop culture. It was definitely by design from some of these smarter promoters. And, Vince McMahon and WWF, WWE today is probably the most successful version of that.
Did you watch the documentary on that came out?
Yes, I did. Yes.
So did I.
I go in and out of subscriptions to Netflix, and I had to make sure I had one at the time because I was so eager to see that.
Yeah, it was a good one. I have to say, I enjoyed it. I thought it was fascinating. So.
As I've gotten older, that's the part of wrestling that most appeals to me is all of the behind the scenes stuff. Most of the characters that are big characters on screen are bigger characters off the screen. And McMahon's perfect example of that. It's unbelievable, that guy in his life.
Yeah, he's nuts. I don't even know how there's people like him that exist.
It's true. It's true.
So I'm thinking about little Jimmy Rugg and your sister. Was your sister also watching wrestling with you, or were you like watching alone?
She was not interested in that at all. No, she was not watching it with me. She was also not reading my comic books. No, there was a neighborhood kid that liked it. A lot of the kids at school watched it. I had one neighbor that was very close to me, and we would actually get together and watch wrestling and like find ways to get a copy of the pay-per-view, like a tape maybe after it had just aired or whatever. And I remember we made my mother make Killer Bee masks. I don't know if you remember the Killer Bees were a tag team in WWF in the 80s. And what they would do, they look kind of similar, same size guys and everything, would have the same color trunks and boots. And they had these masks that they would roll out of the ring and put on, and then they would switch places throughout they would duck in and out throughout the match because they looked the same. And I made my poor mother make like 2 masks so me and my friend could try to be Killer Bees. And she did pretty well with it. I regret that I don't still have that mask today.
Right?
Yeah.
You just don't know.
Yep.
But that social element was definitely a part of it. Watching it with friends, talking about it, having action figures, eventually having video games, like being able to wrestle each other in video games was awesome because it was kind of like pro wrestling where like one character or one of the players would get an edge. And it's the worst feeling ever. Your character wouldn't perform. So then you're just like having moves done to you. And yeah, it was, it's very fun. It's somehow that those dynamics just work extremely well.
What was your favorite wrestling video game?
Probably Nintendo's Pro Wrestling. That was probably my first one. And so that's the one that's when I was playing the most video games. And I liked that game. Sometimes these games don't work very well, but that one worked pretty good. There were a variety of moves and characters, and so that's definitely my favorite.
Did you have like a favorite character that you played, favorite wrestler that you stuck with, or was it like, whichever that's moves?
I didn't have a standout. We would kind of roll around with different characters and stuff like that. I remember Starman was interesting, because he was a masked wrestler, and I think he was all purple, and that was very different. But no, I didn't have a favorite in that game. It was whoever.
Yeah.
What about now? Is there any wrestler you were kind of like, now I have this wrestler and I kind of, given the whole story of this wrestler and everything, that you kind of admire as a favorite?
Gosh.
Probably
CM Punk would be my favorite active wrestler now. And, he's written some comics. I've done signings in his comic book, not the store he owns, but the store he goes to in Chicago. So that's kind of cool. I enjoy his character and, the history of that wrestler. I've never met him, so I have no idea what he's like in real life, but I enjoy the character that he's, brought to life through wrestling. Probably like all time, I really, really fell in love with Roddy Piper towards the end of his life. Yeah. He was doing a podcast and he was so positive, and had this huge, like enexuberant energy about him. It was kind of infectious. And I would listen to this podcast and whoever was on, he'd tell him he loved them and over. And it just endeared him to my heart. It was very different than most of the podcasters I was listening to, like high energy and a lot of positivity. And I was listening to it whenever he actually passed, and I still had 20 episodes or something, and I had to sort of parse them out so that I could, keep hold on to that as long as I possibly could.
He became my favorite after he did the movie. I think it was They Live. Was that the movie?
Yes.
Oh, one of my favorite movies. Absolutely loved it. And it still holds up. And when I saw him in that, I did like this deep dive on him. And, you're right. He's just got this like thing about him that makes you like him a lot. You just want to root for him. He's just positive. He's nice. He's just, real good guy. And also he's a good wrestler.
You know what's funny? Like he's notorious in wrestling history for being like the worst guy, and a lot of the heels, the villains, they have reputations of being the nicer people in real life, which is kind of the way life goes. I feel like it's a pretty good illustration of real life. You can learn a lot from professional wrestling, and that might be one of the secrets. But in most of his career, he was as bad as it comes. He had what they would call like white heat in places where he had been stabbed 3 or 4 times and would actually ended up by the end of his career had a leather jacket that was custom made with kind of like, I don't know if it was Kevlar, but it was something to protect him from basically a knife. And, at that point, I think he was beloved. But early in his career, he was not. Like he made money because he was hated. And the heels were the people that sold tickets. People would pay because they wanted to see those guys get beat up, and he was one of the best at making people want to see him get beat up.
So wait, I have not heard about the stabbing. So people would just like attack him at a bar. He's like just hanging out, and someone would want to like confront him.
It would be at wrestling events. Um, Wrestling's very cleaned up now. Like you're not going to see that. There's security. There are wide aisles. There are barricades, in front rows. But historically, that's not the case. A lot of the territory wrestling, you might have an off-duty policeman for security, maybe one guy, maybe not even that. And the aisles weren't well defined. So, these guys were coming and going like from the locker room to the ring, very close to fans. There were a lot of incidents over the years, especially with like the heels, where somebody from the crowd would take a swing at somebody. Sometimes the heels would swing back. There would be riots whenever the bad guys were getting heat on the good guy. There would be riots where people would storm rings, throw chairs, do all kinds of stuff. And it wasn't uncommon that some of these guys would get stabbed or would get attacked by fans. Sometimes the fans would wait outside the buildings afterwards for them. They'd have to sneak them out or have security walk them out. Sometimes even the baby faces would have to help them by maybe running interference with their cars just so that the heels could get out of town in one piece.
Is there like any wrestlers from back then where you thought their gimmicks were just like the best and the worst? Like, like we're talking about like Roddy Piper and how he was the worst because people just hated him, but it also made him the best because that was what he was supposed to be doing. It got people riled up enough to stab him, obviously. But are there any others that you think were just the absolute best gimmick?
Oh, gosh, I don't know what the best gimmick is. If you know a wrestler from history, they probably had a really good gimmick. And those gimmicks also, the best gimmicks often kind of crossed over into real life. So there was the movie The Iron Claw. It came out maybe 2 years ago to pretty good critical acclaim. And it's about the Von Erich family. And so their gimmick was really that they were sons of a very successful wrestler who was a promoter in Texas. They were athletic, good looking, young, and very, very popular in the territory. And I don't even know what that gimmick would be, except second generation wrestlers, good looking young guys. But I mean, they were like the Beatles or something. People lost their mind with them. And, again, the gimmick isn't exactly there. All American boys or something, good old boys, something like that. Bruno Sammartino, I'm from Pittsburgh, and Bruno Sammartino immigrated here when he was a baby from Italy. So this was kind of his second home. And he was a huge star, in New York City for Vince McMahon's father. And his real life story is his mother hid him in the mountains hiding from Nazis when he was a baby. And afterwards, whenever they kind of like after World War II and they came back out of the mountains, the doctor saw Bruno Sammartino, who was a baby at the time, and said, he's going to die. He's malnourished. He's just not going to make it. And of course, he did make it. He survived. His mother nursed him back to health. And when he was living here as a young man, he was bullied and kind of small. And he found weightlifting as a way to kind of build himself back up, and to overcome the bullies and the stuff that he was struggling with, into the point that he became like a massive, power lifter, super strong Superman type. And I don't know that his gimmick was anything besides his real life story, but he was beloved. Like, he has records for selling out Madison Square Garden more than anybody, like in the history of Madison Square Garden. So I don't know what his gimmick is, but he certainly connected with a fan base for multiple generations, and his real life story is just unbelievable.
It's cool to know that sometimes a really personal story can also be the gimmick.
Yeah.
Be what that wrestler is about.
It's more than just like, the one-liners.
Yeah, and I made this up completely.
Yeah,
which is fine too. It's just, it's
which is funny because like even after we get out of the 80s and everything, and I lost track of wrestling after that, but you still kind of get fed like the whole like, can you smell what the Rock is cooking, and you can't see me coming, and like you still know all of it. It's just so
it's really pervasive.
Crazy. It really is pervasive.
Speaking of the way wrestling used to be, the one wrestling match I went to, it was mid 80s, and it's 83, 84. And my friends were like, hey, we're going to go see Sergeant Slaughter fight the Iron Sheik. You got to come. And I'm like, cool. Like, I didn't know wrestling, but I knew who those guys were. And obviously early 80s, the whole Iranian versus America thing was fever pitch and boiling over. And you could feel it in the arena, which was, speaking of shady old places, that was barely held together by Cheese Whiz and, asbestos. The Olympic Auditorium, okay, built for the Olympics in 32, and it's the 80s. So it's not looking good in there. It's not smelling good. It's not looking good. It was just dangerous. The whole place felt like it could go up at any minute. It was, and when people in those old places, when people started to go nuts, you feel it in the building shaking. It was fun.
Yeah, that's a classic venue. That's LA, right?
Yeah, LA.
Yeah, that's Piper. That's where Roddy Piper becomes Roddy Piper.
Really?
He feuded with the Guerreros, a very famous wrestling family. Geez, at this point, they might be 3 or 4 generations of Guerreros that have wrestled. And it's funny because he was very close to that family, and they made a lot of money, but that's where he got the heat. That's where he caused riots and people to rip chairs out of the floor to try to get at him. May have been where he was stabbed. That's a pretty legendary venue. It goes back all the way, like Gorgeous George would have made his reputation there. And I just did a questionnaire for somebody about my Mount Rushmore of wrestlers, and Gorgeous George is on there because he was like one of the first television superstars. He had the bleach blonde hair. Like, he kind of understood what's a gimmick that comes through the television screen, right? At a time when people's televisions were, 9-inch black and white screens. And that was it. Close-ups on him with blonde curly hair was enough to, again, get heat, to get people excited to see somebody shut this flamboyant guy up. And that's where he really started, and that's where he was headquartered out of. And that was a place that launched wrestling too, as being, he was a celebrity. Like, he interacted with celebrities in that time period in LA. So pretty legendary venue, even if it may be not
hey, listen,
best
I
for
love
wear.
it. I've always been able to, my father was a boxer, so I appreciate those tarted little joints, I was raised in LA, but I was born in New York City, and my dad is very New York. And so he loved those places. He'd go find downtown boxing gyms. He'd let my brother and I stay home from school. And so the Olympic Auditorium, you're absolutely right. I knew, even though the paint was chipping and it was just health hazard central, that I appreciated the kind of coolness of that.
Is it still there?
Oh yeah, it's still there. It's of course, like many things in Los Angeles, at some point, some church group buys it. Those religious ceremonies. So that's what it is now. Who knows what it might become in the future? But yeah, it's still there. Big congregations in there having a good time. But yeah, it's so true, though. I remember just how packed it was, shoulder to shoulder. There was an energy about that place. I almost became, I did have a new appreciation for wrestling after that. It's kind of like how you ever seen a musician, you're like, oh, they're okay.
Yeah.
And then you see them live and you're all, this is,
Yeah.
It just changes it.
Absolutely.
I have a lot of friends who they like wrestling live, because it's a show. It's a big, extravaganza. So it's a very different experience than watching it on TV now. It's interesting because early in wrestling history, it was a great sport on television whenever, you couldn't watch a baseball game on TV in the 50s. You couldn't follow anything. It was so small, but wrestling worked. But now, with indie wrestling and all these different wrestling types, seeing it live is really a lot of people's preferred way to see it because it is a different experience than watching it on television and watching the heavily produced version of it.
Never seen it live. I kind of wish I had.
What do you recommend for people who don't know wrestling, but you think they would like it? How do you what's your kind of gateway wrestling that you would recommend for them?
I've never even thought about that. I tend to listen to podcasts. I had fallen out of wrestling. Chris, you mentioned, kind of losing track of it, but then knowing The Rock's catchphrase and some of this more successful stuff. I fell out of it. I don't know when, middle school, high school, wrestling kind of had a lull in the late 80s, early 90s. And like a lot of people, I lapsed. That's when I was really into comics and starting to, get into girls and all these other distractions. I came back to it through podcasts. So I listened to an episode of Stone Cold's podcast where he actually watched a famous wrestling match, and he kind of almost like a director's commentary walked through it. And listening to these podcasts, because when podcasting first shows up, it's comedians and wrestlers are who I'm attracted to because these are people who made a living from what they could do with a microphone. They were perfect for podcasts. And the wrestlers would always talk about storytelling in the matches. And that intrigued me because I'm drawing superhero comics. So you're telling me I can tell a story in the fight scene. And Stone Cold basically walked through this match, like a 15-minute match, and explained all of it, the psychology behind it, the timing, just all these nuances, again, like a director commentary. And that really got me back into it, because then I'm listening to more wrestling podcasts and it's just the storytelling. I might recommend for people, there was just a movie called, some of the stuff outside of actual wrestling is probably where I would point people. My favorite wrestling thing I think I've ever seen is Glow, the Netflix series. I just rewatch it over and over. I absolutely love it.
We were going to ask you because I love Glow. Love it.
Everything that I think I know about wrestling, and anybody who's in wrestling will tell you I don't know anything, and I'll admit I don't. I've never been trained. I have some friends who wrestle, but I don't really know anything about the business. But I do listen to enough of these stories that I at least think I understand. And the way I understand it, Glow captures it really, really well. That blurring of what's real and what isn't. But there's been a lot of these kinds of programs, and I think these documentaries, movies about these characters. Queen of the Ring is based on a woman wrestler from the 30s, 40s, and 50s that was it's probably streaming now somewhere, but it was in theaters last year. I read the book. I haven't seen the movie yet, but the book is fantastic. So I think that movie is pretty well reviewed. I think that would be a gateway. There have been great series like Dark Side of the Ring, which is, you can find on streaming now. And I think they've had 5 or 6 seasons where each episode focuses on, unfortunately, a dark episode in wrestling history. If you can stomach that, it's not that different than true crime. And certainly some of those episodes would be true crime. One of the characters robbed banks. One of them sadly was stabbed after a match by the promoter and died in the locker room. So, there are these dramatic stories that kind of show how multifaceted these people are. You get to see both the character that they made. Now a lot of that's manufactured. Like if it's a WWE character, a lot of that is built by the WWE machine. And there's a show about that now on Netflix called Unreal, where they go inside the writer's room and the wrestlers are interacting with the creative teams. The parallels to superhero comics are great. But in the past, the characters were pretty much up to the individual performer to develop because they would move from territory to territory. Roddy Piper kept getting to be Roddy Piper. He learned how to be popular in LA. Then he was able to take that, to Georgia or to Charlotte or ultimately to New York and, continue to use what he learned and continue to be the character that he built. And to me, that's the richness of wrestling. And all these guys are very creative and they're all coming up with different characters based on who they are, what they're interested in, what their personalities are like. And so there's a lot of programs that focus on those. If you're a fan of The Rock, WWE has made a ton of documentaries with some of his rivals and, focused on him. So you could watch one of those documentaries and get a little more insight into the wrestling and, possibly that's a gateway. But it's kind of a golden era for wrestling now. If somebody's interested, there's probably a lot of great entry points depending on what caught their eye.
It's funny because back when I was in college and a little after college, so that would be the mid 90s, I had a roommate, I'll give him a shout out, Sylvester. And he was super into comics because I was also into comics, and I had right after college had gone right into a career in comics. And he wanted to be a wrestler really bad. And he was super into it. And so I got to find out all this behind the scenes stuff of creating a character, the costuming, going for tryouts. And I lost touch with him, a few years in, and, we moved out separate ways, and then reconnected with him maybe about 2 years ago at San Diego Comic-Con. Like, we're friends on Facebook, and we met up at San Diego Comic-Con, and he had made it in wrestling all the way up to, like, I guess what's the minor leagues, kind of, which I didn't even know it was a thing. But yeah, it's really hard to break in. And you can actually say, like, the relationship between comics and wrestling is incredibly similar of, like, independent versus, like, corporate and all that stuff. And it was just fascinating, to find out that it was like that. Like, that was one of the most educational things that I found out about wrestling. I was mind blown.
Yeah, I'm glad you say that. It's a really good comparison, that idea of like, oh, you could make it on the indie scene or maybe like opening match, It's funny because they have like mid card, and then of course main event is what you aspire to. And very few people make it to that level. And I often say with comics, like, I encourage everybody, if they're even a little bit interested in making comics, that they should make comics. It doesn't have to be the way that you make a living to make comics. Like, I usually use basketball as a comparison. Like, everybody has played basketball. Very, very, very small percentage get paid for it. And of those, very, very small percentage are actually superstars and make like a living out of it. And I think that comics, wrestling, even professional sports at this point, they're part of the entertainment field, and it's just so competitive, and to your point, Sylvester trying to make it is very, very competitive to break in. And wrestling used to have the history too that it was protected. So if you were in wrestling and somebody came up and wanted to be in it, you basically kicked their ass. Told him it was real and told him to get lost. Hulk Hogan famously, when he was trying to break in, was being kind of trained or tested or try out, and the guy broke his ankle. That was very common, that these guys would take your money. They would what they would call stretch you, which, was basically putting you in wrestling holds that hurt and could do serious damage. It was it's always been a very difficult industry to break into from what I've read and heard wrestlers talk about.
Can you imagine if comic artists did that? Oh, you want to draw, huh?
Stab them with the pencil.
Stab with pencil. I got my T-square.
They do. Comics people do joke, though, like, however they got into the industry, it was like you found a secret way in, and then the gatekeepers like patched over that unfinished doorway or hole in the office that let you in.
Oh,
it's true. There is backstabbing for sure. There's definitely backstabbing.
Yeah.
So there's some pretty great comic books actually about wrestling. Do you have any comics that you love about wrestling?
My favorite one is probably Whoa Nelly. Jaime Hernandez did that after the first volume of Love and Rockets ended. And if you read Love and Rockets, he and his brother Gilbert have both done wrestling stories and good wrestling stories. They're from I guess LA area, Southern California area. And so wrestling does have a long history there. And that's a really interesting wrestling town because you have luchador influence, which is the Mexican wrestling, and then you have professional, like I guess American wrestling. I don't know what you would call it, but like we were talking about with Roddy Piper and coming through LA, you have multiple types of wrestling there. You probably have a Japanese influence as well, which has a very rich wrestling culture too. And being on the West Coast, I imagine some of that comes through. So they have a good knowledge of wrestling, probably because they have a good knowledge of all pop culture. And Whoa Nelly is my favorite. Actually, Paul Mavridis or Paul Ravoche, I'm sorry, colored a color version of Mechanics, and I actually got a couple of his color guides just recently. and it's a wrestling scene drawn by Jaime Hernandez and then colored. And that's one of my favorites. Daniel Warren Johnson did one called Do a Powerbomb a couple years ago, and it's fantastic. It's I'm not as into contemporary wrestling as like the older stories, but it works really great in an action comic, like because they do stuff that is just it's kind of death defying, and in real life, honestly, it makes me squeamish. Like I just don't want this guy to like end up breaking his head in front, on live TV or at a small venue or whatever. But in a comic book, you don't have that risk, so like all those big moves look great. Those are probably a couple of the standouts, although I actually have a box that's all wrestling comics. Oh, there's one about Andy Kaufman that Box Brown did a couple of years ago. And it's all about, it focuses on when Andy Kaufman went to Memphis for professional wrestling. Like Andy Kaufman, of course, comedian, television actor, huge talent in Hollywood, but he loved wrestling also. And so there's a little tiny bit of his career where he would do intergender wrestling, right? Because he's a skinny comedian. Like it wouldn't make sense if he like went in and tried to fight Hulk Hogan, but he would do these intergender wrestling matches and got a little notoriety with it and tried to bring it to professional wrestling. And Memphis, there was a wrestler there, Jerry Lawler, who recognized, hey, we can make this work. This could be good for business. They were still protecting the business, so they wanted it to look real, but they thought they could do an angle with him, and they did, and it's fantastic. And Box Brown did a book about that, a graphic novel, and it kills me that I can't think of that. I feel unprepared that I don't have my box of wrestling comics with me. But that's a really good one. So I'll probably think of more as we go on. I actually just read one that's not out yet, but that's what I did my Mount Rushmore. I answered some questions for a wrestling comic that's going to be coming up, but I don't think it's announced, so I can't really say too much about it.
While we're on that topic of Mount Rushmore again, so we know Gorgeous George is there. Who else is on that Mount Rushmore?
It's so hard to do these Mount Rushmores, but I had Hulk Hogan, Stone Cold, and Jim Landos. And basically those choices are all, in my opinion, the guys who drew the most money in history. Ultimately, that was what professional wrestling was. It was a business. Today, it's all kinds of stuff. And I don't even know how they measure who draws money at this point. I think you could probably replace anybody on a WWE card and still do record business. The way that industry, or at least the way that company has kind of marketed itself. But in the past, it was a big deal. The main event guys really were responsible for selling tickets and would, of course, be paid in kind, sometimes taking 10% of the gate. But it was their name on the card. If those guys weren't there, everybody made a lot less money. And so that was rarefied air. They had responsibility above and beyond just putting on a good match. And so I think those are the guys that I look at. That's my reasoning behind that Mount Rushmore. It's not necessarily the guys who wrestled the best or whatever, but it was the guys who I think drew the most money in their different eras.
That's really cool because it's true. It's a family, right? Like all those wrestlers, the high tide raises all the boats. All those wrestlers know, hey, we all got a little more bread in our pocket because this star was here. I haven't heard that one. Landos, did you say? I haven't heard of him.
Yeah, he would have been big in like 30s and 40s, and he just sold out everywhere. Like he did more business than anybody ever. And, if you factor in inflation, the amount of money that he drew was, top of wrestling history. He might have been the biggest draw in wrestling history.
Love that. I don't know who that is, and now I want to find out.
Yeah, you're going to look it up after.
Absolutely. I love that. I am so drawn. That is so me. I'm always drawn to those guys that nobody hears about that actually did all the cool stuff,
It's a rabbit hole.
Total rabbit.
You're down it.
Good Superfan podcast. Thank you, Jim Rugg.
Well, I was going to say, the history of wrestling is so fun because there are all these stories. I had mentioned Queen of the Ring, which is Mildred Burke's story, one of the first, women's world champions, and one of the women that actually drew money as well. She traveled all over the world. She helped establish women's wrestling in Japan. She really was one of the early big draws for women's wrestling, as opposed to having them as a gimmick kind of lower down on the card. Around that time, there were also pulp books that were released, like early paperbacks that were kind of a little bit, they're sort of edgy, right? Like they're salacious until you read them and realize like what passes for that in 1940 is like,
yeah.
But there's a couple of those. and it took me years to track them down. And one is called Lady Wrestler or Confessions of a Lady Wrestler. And sometimes when you find like a book written in the 40s, it's not necessarily a fun read. This one was amazing, but what was really interesting is it was like they had inside information because wrestling was still protected then, but the book goes behind the scenes where there's a promoter that puts together pretty much a touring team or family of women who would wrestle each other, but they all stayed together, they traveled together. So in the ring, they're heated rivals, but then in the book, they also track the behind the scenes, kind of the business, the day-to-day life of these characters. And they're like a traveling troupe of performers. They have, some of them don't always get along, but it's not at all what you see in the ring. Like whoever wrote it was smart to the business. Maybe somebody that knew the business contributed to the book or told the writer, kind of how it worked behind the scenes. But it's kind of interesting to see those things where this was all still secret at the time. So, you read that now and think like, wow, this was kind of letting everything out. But then I don't know who was buying that. They might have been sold in like adult shops or something like that.
How long did it take you to locate this, and how did you find out about it?
It's hard to tell how I found out about it. 'Cause it's been many years. I actually found a scanned copy of that one online.
Oh.
And then I had another, there were like two of them, and I can't remember what the other one is, but I found a cheap copy of it on eBay for like $40. And it was like Loves of a Girl Wrestler, I think it was called. And it was equally good, but also kind of an inside, behind a glimpse behind the curtain of wrestling, which surprises me for, books that came out. I think one's in the late 40s and one's in the late 50s.
Wow. So do you collect a lot of that wrestling memorabilia? Or?
Sort of. I have a pretty big wrestling magazine collection.
Okay.
And I always think about what I'm going to do with that. I have it goes back to the 50s, and it's not as big as my comic book collection, but it's pretty large. And I think about doing like a design book or something, writing about the design of wrestling, because especially the covers are so striking. They're primary colors. They're often some sort of graphic violence, like a close up of one of these wrestlers, bloody after a match. And I remember, like, you asked me what got me into wrestling. It's possible that those magazines are what did it, because I would go to the grocery store with my parents and I didn't want to go shop for groceries. So I'd go to like the magazine rack, and that's the stuff that caught my eye. And, now as an adult and, having been a graphic designer for a while, I look at those covers and I think, of course, like those are always going to pop. You could put those on a magazine rack with virtually any magazine cover I've ever seen, and you'd be hard pressed not to at least pause somebody's eye, even if they're not interested in wrestling, because they're so graphic. Not just in terms of violence, but in the big, bold fonts, in the primary colors. If you've seen Darren Aronofsky's The Wrestler movie,
Mm-hmm.
the opening credits are sort of based on like the wrestling magazine cover motifs, which I love. I like that whole movie. I think it's really great, but the opening credits are just, they really speak to me, and it's because of that aesthetic. So sometimes I think about doing something like that with the magazines, because I don't know what else to do with them.
No, that sounds amazing. A design book with that. Oh my gosh. Like that's historical. It's like a deep dive into it. I think that'd be fantastic. I'd look at that.
Totally. It sounds like a Toshin book, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
That would be a good place for it. The Japanese wrestling, Terry Funk is one of my favorite wrestlers, and he had an incredible career. He was an NWA champion whenever that really, really meant something. He was in WWE in the 80s. Just a fantastic, kind of invented hardcore wrestling in the 90s with ECW when he was like in his 50s. If you've ever heard of the documentary Beyond the Mat, he's one of the wrestlers that's featured in there. And he was always like a champion of younger wrestlers. And he's another guy like Piper, where like when I would hear him in interviews, I just really loved that attitude. Like he was always, a lot of people complain about, new wrestlers or, the business has changed. And he was always the champion of like whatever the new stuff was, push these young guys, they're working hard, all this. His father was a promoter, and then when his father died, he and his brother took over the promotion, and they worked with a Japanese promoter. So they would book Americans in Japan, and then they would also bring Japanese wrestlers to America to kind of like just really for them, both sides, to learn more about wrestling, young wrestlers and also guys who could draw money. And when he was in Japan, he was working for a wrestling company that did not have a big television contract. And so the key for that company to become more popular was magazines. And the key for that meant, you basically had to have the bloodiest match, and that put you on the cover, and that got attention. And so that's part of how Terry Funk is credited with like inventing this hardcore style, because he recognized that was the one marketing outlet that we had. And then, he took advantage of that before anybody else realized, how to get over there. Not how to get, other people were getting over, but the company needed, that was the one way that the company could get over. And he was the guy behind that.
I want to sidebar real quick.
Uldera Candles and Spirits presents the Joe Calavera Radio Hour. Joe Calavera, punisher of predators, friend of the friendless, and danger to the dangerous, has 48 hours to crack the case, or back to the crypt he goes. Join us each week for another daring adventure of our undead PI. This week, our dead desperado is called upon to find the missing wife of a prominent bank president. Is it a case of a lost spouse? Or did the dear missus make a withdrawal from her honey's bank that she couldn't pay back? Tune in as our skull-faced flatfoot attempts to solve the case of the withdrawn wife.
Now, how many of these magazines do you have, and how does your wife feel about your collection of magazines and comics?
I have about 1,500, so, like maybe 15 boxes all filed. I have them organized by title and, date. My wife went to London last summer, and I bought, I had a small collection, and she went away for a week. And by day 2, I was sort of like lonely and bored, and crossed paths with I knew where there was a big collection. I ended up buying the whole collection, and then spent the rest of her vacation, I was putting them all in order, which is some of the fun, because then you get to see like, what did I get in this collection? So they're in storage right now. So that's kind of how she likes them there. That's how she feels about it.
Oh, that's too bad. You got to get your own separate room. That's what you got to do. Like your little.
I have a couple of rooms of comics.
Oh, okay. So this is like a thing. I see.
Yeah, it's too much. It's too much.
All right.
Hey, Jim, compare and contrast for us. The comparisons are obvious, but what are some of the contrasts between like an American tradition of wrestling and lucha? Like, what is lore-wise, style-wise?
Yeah, so I'm not the best person to speak to this, but I can talk about it a little bit. The masks are kind of like a historical tradition for lucha. And that's something that, honestly, I'm not the best to speak at. It's very cultural. And I've had friends who are Mexican-American tell me about that history and that lore. And that'll be passed down sometimes from father to son. It becomes like almost like a superhero identity in the ring. But that's probably cheapening it to say it that way. But it's very much a part of the power of that character and preserving that identity. The big difference, there's one that's just ridiculous, and it is basically they wrestle left-handed versus American wrestling right-handed. And again, I'm not the best person to talk about this stuff because it's really inside. The reason
That's
I say
I
that
knew, so thanks.
is I listened to Jim Cornette's podcast, and he talks about that because the two styles, and this is the most obvious difference, is the luchadors are very acrobatic, very high flying. And this goes back, decades, because there would be Mexican stars that would come to the US and be celebrated and huge. And there weren't very many, but the ones that did would have this style that was different. And that was part of their appeal was, one, it's different, and two, it looks amazing. So they would often be fan favorites and get over because they were doing stuff that none of the Americans could do. Now, those things are a little bit, they cross over more and more because American wrestlers will go to Mexico and they'll learn some of the Mexican traditions and the wrestling moves. And it's a different performance, what the audience expects. So if you're going to go there as an American, you have to kind of learn that wrestling style and how to make the fans appreciate what you're doing, and vice versa. And so you see, like now, there are tons of luchadors that are known in America that wrestle for WWE, AEW. There was Lucha Underground for a while, was a series. WWE just bought one of the big promotions in Mexico, AAA. So, these things become much more international. If you see lucha wrestling and you like it, now you can actually see more. In the past, you were sort of stuck with like, well, there's none on my local television station, or, I'm not in a city that has any of that touring through. So it was much more rare. But now you can see it. And, style wise, the storytelling is different in that it is a little bit more flashy. The moves may not sell as much, but it may be more of like these dazzling moves telling the story of the match and how the crowd is reacting. It's interesting. There's a big contrast between like the Mexican wrestling and the Japanese wrestling as well, where the Japanese wrestling, the crowds, whenever you hear wrestlers, like I'll hear it on podcasts or I'll read about it in their biographies, but it's the crowds are very quiet in Japan compared to, say, American audiences or compared to Mexican audiences that are much more, excited and making noise and sort of part of the show. And the Japanese audience, they love the wrestling, but the way they express that is different. So, I think there are significant differences between all three cultures. Europe has a wrestling history that's probably defined more by scientific wrestling, mat wrestling, chain wrestling, they might call it. And like the other places, it goes back decades and maybe even 100 years or more. And it's just a little bit more distinct with who was successful there and how did audiences respond. And pretty soon that's what you get more of. And that defines the area.
That is so fascinating. I was going to ask about Japanese because, now we're going into like all these different cultures, all these different countries, and Japanese like sumo wrestling and all that stuff. Like it's huge over there too. Like this is like a thing. Like this is not just isolated to like the mid 80s and us being fascinated with it. Like this is a historical, pastime for people that's just endured.
Most of what I like about wrestling is that history, and it's pretty well chronicled. These wrestlers are great storytellers. So as they get older, they do write books. They do make documentaries about these things, and the best stories, they stick around. So sometimes you do get a movie version of some of these stories or some of these characters' lives. So there's a lot of that history is out there. The magazines chronicle a lot of it too. So if you like any of these aspects, like I had said earlier, for a newcomer, any doorway will get you in. But also if you like one particular type of wrestling, you can have a lifetime of it. It's very similar to comics in that way.
Oh, it is similar to comics.
So similar. And the crossover between comics and wrestling is really a thing.
Yeah, it really is. Which it's funny because sometimes when we do these podcast episodes, the fandoms, like we can always bring it right back around to comics somehow, some way, no matter what it is. And it's like it comes out, with creators and their passions and how it like either it's a driving force or it was something that taught them more about it, or
it's this glowing center to everything.
Yeah, to everything. It's just like it refills the creative well in a way and gives them juice. So.
We could easily switch wrestling with comics and talk about Japanese comics, Mexican comics, European comic traditions. And, they have their own kind of nuances, but it's still, they're very distinct from one to another, the same way the wrestling style is. And it's probably true of any cultural, area that we share. But wrestling and comics are the two that I focus on. So that's where I see, these differences and similarities.
Well, I'm seeing that a lot because, I oversee a manga line and the sports manga is huge. Like, and so I get a lot of that in, baseball, football, even wrestling, which unfortunately I don't have a really good one yet that I can do. But I always found it curious on how it's so popular to do these sports mangas, but yet we haven't quite brought that over into American comics in a way where you get so detailed and so into it, like, and they know everything. I mean, they do pinballing, like everything that you can think of. They have a manga about where they do a deep dive and like they go into the intricacies of it all.
The procedures, yeah.
And it's just awesome. It's great. And I'm like, why don't we do that in American comics?
Why do you think we don't do that in American comics?
Short attention spans. I don't know.
I wonder if it's skill set. I was going to do a running comic about like a high school cross country running team. And so I was reading some sports manga to kind of see how they approach that, right? They have tons of like young adult, sports stories. And I read one about volleyball, and I don't know much about volleyball. And it's so dynamic. They're doing like amazing foreshortening, of like, it just looks spectacular. It's like the Matrix, at volleyball. but they're also simultaneously in an early volume explaining the rules and strategies of volleyball in the course of a game that's being played. And like, I just marveled at it as a cartoonist, like the storytelling. If you told me to do, if that were my task, if I were assigned like, hey, we hired you to draw this comic and here's the scene, I think I would quit. Like I'm not sure I'm capable of even doing that because it's so complex. There was so much going on and yet it was easy to follow. So I wonder sometimes if that's part of it, but
it has to be, because you're right. Because when I got the pitch in for wrestling, there was no artist attached. And I just remember saying, I will have to find an artist that knows wrestling like hardcore, because drawing it and drawing the positions and the moves and everything else.
You got to be able to write what you know. You got to know it if you want to do it. You really do.
It's true.
Somebody who's great at anatomy, like it's one thing to draw, a hero pose. Now, like twist that into a pretzel and, have it be coming off a top rope. The great wrestling comic, if you're doing like imports, is Kaneki Man, which is when I was a kid, it was the little pink muscle figures.
Yeah.
That's based on this super long running manga that's just phenomenal and amazingly dynamic and would have guest appearances, I think unauthorized, of like Terry Funk and Dusty Rhodes and, some of the big Asian wrestlers. But it's there are over 100 volumes of it and it's really phenomenal. And I think there may have been an import of it at some point, but it's super expensive and impossible to find. So
is it in English or is it?
The import, I think they imported a couple volumes and they were translated, but they're very expensive. And I think I've seen them one time. But that would be incredible. If you would bring that to America and translate it to English, I would be very grateful.
Okay. That's giving me something to think about for sure.
Superfan podcast. Bring it back.
I'm really, my brain can't get past this amazing question about why like explainer manga and sports manga didn't take off here. And I think part of it, maybe it will happen in a decade from now that you have enough exposure of that kind of storytelling, right? But it's also that there is the intimidation factor. When Anthony Bourdain did the Hunger Ghost graphic novel for Dark Horse, and the thing he would give intense notes on was anything in the kitchen. Like if the chef's hat was wrong, like it would make him very upset. Right. And because if you are an expert there, you just cannot see it portrayed in a way that is not appropriate, not authentic.
No
right?
creative license.
Art stuff is just like, it's the keeps and tights and it's out of the imagination.
Yeah. No,
there are some great food mangas. And if you look at them, even in black and white, the food looks delicious and they're extremely detailed. And, I remember reading one and they were like making some kind of egg dish, and it was a competition, right? A couple of these students at this culinary school, but they were using like these little drops of like chicken fat that had like congealed. And that was like the secret ingredient, like they had somehow made that. And then they were able to like drop it on and have it basically melt, give it this flavor. And it's like, again, I don't know how I don't know that I could draw that, it's like, it's such a kind of a fundamental difference. If you read Frederick Schott's Manga, which came out like in the mid 80s, 86, I think, he talks about like the samurai, like the samurai attitude permeating through those sports media, or sports manga. And it was like whoever basically all the characters, but of course the protagonist, it's the drive to be the best. And I also think there was a division between art and sports in this country. So like, all of my comic book friends were like nerds. Mm-hmm. Now it's, comics aren't as nerdy. So like you could have like everybody, I think, maybe reads comics if they read. I don't think comics is a problem now, if you're a reader. And so maybe that opens up the door to sports, but when I was a kid, like sports, like jocks would have been, the enemy of comic book readers. And now I'm not sure that divide exists. So maybe we will see some sports comics in America.
Yeah. I mean, I know there's a few that we're putting out. I think one is called Pastime. Joe Harris is doing it with us, and it's and Joe's really into sports. He he's got baseball, football, like a bunch of stuff. So I think it's a matter of finding like the writers who are passionate about both, like yourself, like wrestling and comics, and finding those people and just convincing them, no, you can merge these two things together and have it be successful and people will want to read it because you're not the only one out there. It's a matter of being inclusive, and
You also see, I think, sports storytelling in other media that's advancing. Things like The Last Dance, I think, had real mainstream success.
So good.
You didn't have to be an NBA fan to watch that. It seemed like that captured, a lot of people's imagination. So maybe as more examples of things like that, like ESPN's 30 for 30, finding that hook or whatever in these various sports stories may be important, and it might be something that people are thinking about differently as we see more and more examples.
it's true.
It's crazy to me. Do you ever watch old NFL films?
Yes.
With like the John Facenda, and he's doing Rudyard Kipling's If over slow motion footage of football.
Yes.
Can you imagine?
Maybe with a symphony behind it as well.
Yeah.
Yes.
Amazing. So different than today, right? I miss it big time.
Wow. That's just, I didn't even know that existed.
Oh my goodness, it's beautiful.
It really is.
Yeah.
Yeah, because you're one of the guys too. You like football.
I love
So-
sports and art. Yeah, I had like I said, my dad was a boxer, right? But he was also an actor. So he was this tough guy, but he was also really sensitive. So I guess I got lucky in that way.
I love sports and wrestling, and I watch almost none of them. I listen to podcasts and I read books. Like sports writers, that used to be a big point of pride. So, Pittsburgh is kind of a sports town.
Kind of.
And I would listen to football games more than I would watch them. And one of the broadcasters, Myron Cope, was like a very distinct Southwestern Pennsylvania voice. Loved him, full of character. You would do television sports. So, had like a big, robust career as a sports reporter. And he always would point to his writing as what he wanted to be known for, like the couple of books that he authored or articles that he wrote. And like boxing has a rich tradition of sports writing, history. So it is interesting, like the way you can engage with sports without even not even watching them. That's all the big money is TV rights, but the stories are something else.
This has been education.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jen. This has really been great.
Absolutely.
Oh, my pleasure. I could talk about wrestling.
Well, we might have to do a part 2 on this one. This was awesome.
Yeah.
Are you gonna ever bring you had an out of print zine on wrestling? Are you gonna bring that back into print?
I actually just reprinted it. Yeah, it's funny. That's a zine that it's a collection of like wrestling art that I've made over the years, sometimes commissions. I did covers for a WWE book for a while, so I have like the original art in there, and some are just fun, entertaining myself. And I could not sell that book at all at conventions. And whenever I put it online, it sells out instantly every time. I can't keep it in print if I have it on my web store. So I did just reprint them, but I haven't put it up online yet. I need to actually sign them and get it ready. So tomorrow I plan to sign those, and they should be up soon. But then they'll probably be gone shortly after that.
That is so fascinating that you can't do it at cons, but online it works. Wow.
Yeah, it's bizarre. I did Heroes Con last year, and Arn Anderson, one of the Four Horsemen, great wrestler from the 80s, had done a graphic novel and ended up sitting like right behind me. And it was like this amazing moment and he moved from a different location. And somebody was like, oh, like they had moved him because like he was kind of on the edge of the convention hall floor. And I guess the person next to me didn't show up. So they said they put a sign up that, like he had moved to sit by you. And I'm like, this is amazing. I'm going to go and get this sign. And it's going to be like Arn Anderson and Jim Rugg on this sign. And the sign was like written in marker. And it was like the wrestler moved over by Jim Ruff. And it was like, wow.
Oh.
It was kind of great, but also like not what I was hoping for.
Oh, man.
Your alter ego when you become a spy.
Yes. Yeah. It, keeps you humble.
It is true though. Like I didn't even think about that, but like at conventions, wrestlers are like a staple.
Oh my goodness,
at comic
right?
conventions.
Right?
Yeah. I mean, it does kind
I
of go
can't
hand
tell
in
you how many
hand.
times at my booth I'm trying to sell my independent comic book, and people walk up to me, do you know what the wrestlers are? And I'm all, shut up. They're that way.
Mm-hmm.
We talk about like comic book fans being wrestling fans because there are similarities, but a lot of the wrestlers are also comic book fans. So it's a pretty natural crossover. It's funny whenever I meet someone who's really adamantly against one but loves the other. And, those people exist too. But in my head, it's like, okay, I can see if you're not really into it, but to be like hardcore against it, that usually surprises me because it's like, you're drawing like dudes in tights rolling around in an alley fighting. Like it's kind of the same, almost the same exact thing. But
Yeah. Where's the line?
some people, and there's a history of some really good artists in that are wrestlers. Bret Hart is known as a very, very good artist and would draw like cartoons basically of other wrestlers, in the locker room, because like wrestling was, you get to the venue and who knows, you might not be on, on a match for a couple of hours. So you're bored behind the scenes every night. He would draw funny pictures of, his fellow wrestlers and amuse everybody. And if you've ever seen his art, he's very good. And Jerry Lawler, who I mentioned feuded with Andy Kaufman, he is like professional quality illustrator. It's unbelievable. He actually broke into wrestling as an artist. Like he would send drawings to the local wrestling program and the promoters like, these are great, put them on air. And eventually he becomes, one of the greatest wrestlers of all time. And he still does covers now sometimes for some of the wrestling comics. So,
Wow.
It kind of goes both ways. It's not just cartoonists or comic book fans that like the wrestlers. It's a lot of wrestlers find probably, a lot of the same commonalities in comics that I see in wrestling.
Yeah, for sure.
Jim, seriously, that was amazing. Thank you.
Well, good. I'm glad you think that. I used to do podcasts and YouTubes, and we would finish up, and it would always be whoever we talked to, no matter how great they were or how big of a celebrity. They would always be like, "Oh, is that okay? I feel like that didn't go well." It's like I have the same feelings.
It was great. It was great.
Yes, we can assure you it went
Well,
great.
I enjoyed it, so thank you for having me. It was very fun.
And that always works.
Yes, absolutely. It was a pleasure having you on here and
total
talking
pleasure.
about this
Really
for
great.
real. Yeah, it was good.
One of my favorite parts of the Superfan podcast is the cocktails. So, David, what's this week's cocktail?
So this week's cocktail, inspired by the conversation with Jim Rugg about wrestling, is the artichoke hold cocktail.
Artichoke hold.
That is so clever.
Artichoke hold. I love that.
I love that. I love anything with Chinar, which this cocktail has. So it is the Drunkard's Almanac is where you can find this cocktail. Or you can go to the Superfan Signal Substack, say that 3 times fast. I will tease for listeners, this drink has bourbon, it has Chinar, an orange peel, orange bitters, and Luxardo.
Well, that sounds amazing. But what is the second one?
Chinar.
Chinar? What is that?
It's artichoke liqueur.
Oh, it is. It's actual artichoke liqueur.
Yeah, next time you come over, I will. Next time you are not driving over, I'll make you a series of drinks because it's really fun to see how it builds, right?
Yeah. Okay. All right. I like that. That's fun.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I will tell everyone what our dessert is now.
Yes, tell us about the dessert, Chris Simon.
The dessert is called the Pile Driver Parfait.
Pile driver parfait and the artichoke hold.
Yes, it's a no-holds-barred dessert with layers that build suspense like a title match. So since wrestling is about spectacle, this dessert is big, flashy, and stacked with contrasting flavors. So you can customize your wrestler, your parfait, by swapping flavors. And you can do it color-coded to match your favorite wrestler's costume. Yes.
Right.
So,
Blues and golds, your
yes.
reds and
matcha for
whites,
green, strawberry
green
for
and yellow.
blue. So if you want the exact recipe, of course, go to the Superfan Signal Substack.
Superfan Signal Substack.
The Superfan Podcast is a production of Superfan Media. This episode was edited by Bryant Dillon with production help by Fanbase Press. The Superfan Podcast logo is designed by Chriswell Lappin, whose design work can be seen at chriswelllappin.com. The theme song was written by friend of the podcast Dan Schulman and performed by Low in the Shag.
And now, a word about our sponsors. Fanbase Press is the media award-winning and an Eisner and a Harvey Awards-nominated comic book publisher and geek culture website. Fanbase Press produces new and distinctive works, as well as daily reviews, interviews, and podcasts that span the pop culture spectrum and give voice to the themes, ideals, and people that make geekdom so exceptional.